and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, summer hopes, summer blues and summer queues. What lies ahead for airlines this summer? And everyone wants a piece of Spirit. Why the budget carrier isn't in demand? Does this mean merger mania is back? My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yeah, good. And it's been a while since we've been doing this.
I was going to say long time no see. I mean, in common with the wider industry, I guess the pandemic has caused some changes for us, and we're really glad though that we're still here, still
here.
on Fly Global, and we're keen to get back to doing these regularly again.
So the podcast hiatus is over, we hope, and it's interesting because the timing now coming almost 2 years since the pandemic hit. There's a degree of optimism.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of many things we've probably learned during the pandemic is, not to be too presumptuous about how things are going to go, certainly in the short term. And we know there were a few false starts over the past 2 years. Certainly, there was a point going into 2021 where there was a feeling, the vaccines were proven to work, and there was a feeling that we were perhaps going to have something better than actually turned out. But we're certainly at a point now where I think that confidence is returning. We know that, living in the UK, for example, that most COVID or all COVID restrictions are ended, even though cases are very high, and we'll touch on in a second maybe on how that isn't an entirely consequence-free decision for the airline industry. But that we're certainly, I think, touch wood, and we know well about the potential for variants and things, but we are looking ahead to something, I think, better in the summer. And we're already seeing, going into Easter, a level of demand that is quite pleasing, really, given what everyone's been through. And
to some extent, this is probably the crunch period, isn't it? Because the phrase that we've heard more from, any airline executive you listen to or interview, heard at any point over the past 18 months, 2 years or so, has spoken about pent-up demand. That, this view that, the demand is out there, that is unchanged. It's, regardless of what happens, it's simply the ability to fly that has impacted demand. And this summer, that is going to be put to the test.
It will be, and that's for a number of reasons. I think on the one hand, I guess we're looking at issues with cost of living, high inflation, high energy costs, which obviously also affect the businesses and the airlines with fuel costs. But on the one side, we've got this interesting, very unhelpful dynamic, of course, that looking ahead to what was supposed to be this really strong recovery, and it's not clear how that will affect things. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got that. On the other side, you've got the disruption we're seeing as airlines and airports as well attempt to ramp up operation. The basic logistics of doing that is a big challenge at the moment. And again, being in the UK, it's kind of often a story that excites the general media quite a lot when there's disruption for travel. And I think obviously they've been starved of that kind of story for 2 years. So with the stuff going on at the moment, there's a lot in the press of some of the challenges.
And of course, especially within Europe, I think, and I think we've seen it elsewhere as well. The idea that at peak times of the air travel season that there were delays and the airports were struggling to keep up with demand. I mean, it was a massive story across Europe in the pre-pandemic summers. It's obviously a bit strange, to run an industry a fraction of the summer. Getting on at the moment to being half the size or so, or maybe more. There's still that problem, but that is that issue of going from flat demand in January and February to the summer where many airlines, especially on specific markets, short-haul European is one example, transatlantic market, essentially have capacity at or above the levels they had it before.
Yeah, and that's obviously encouraging. And what we're seeing is, as I touched on before, I think the COVID situation for one, in the UK, there was a lot of, more COVID than ever in recent, there's ever been recorded anyway in recent weeks. And that is obviously affecting workforces, whether it be, and that's the people that are actually already in the industry or have returned to the industry already. So, would that be the airport staff, security staff, or actually on the aircraft themselves. So we're seeing big challenges big challenges there. And as part of that kind of comeback after COVID as well, you've got the challenge of, a lot of airlines and airports have laid off a lot of staff. To bring them back in, they need to be security cleared by government organisations, and they are also being affected by the COVID absences themselves. So there's a whole chain, which means it's taking longer to get either new staff or rehired staff back into these jobs that are so critical for keeping things running. So that's not just a UK thing. I think we're seeing that issue in other countries as well. So, it's not a new, as you say, it's not a new thing to see these kind of, the system struggling to cope with this high demand. And as you say, this isn't demand quite at the level, sort of as a whole anyway, at the level we've perhaps seen, pre-COVID, but it is proving very challenging. And it in a weird way, it's a sign of normality that even though COVID's part of the reasoning, it's kind of a sign of normality that there are actually stories like that.
And of course, it's also a sign of this strange new reality we're in. At Heathrow, they reported their busiest month for traffic in March. Yet that is predominantly being driven by outbound tourism from the UK. Inbound, there are still a number of restrictions depending where you're flying from. You still have the testing requirement, and of course for airports all around the world, they are still having to deal with this extra processing. And anyone who's attempted to travel over the past year or so will be fully aware of the documentation, the requirement to test. Even as that's starting to ease, that isn't easing everywhere, is it?
No, what you perhaps don't appreciate being based in the UK, where we don't now have to travel back into the country, we don't have to do anything else, any of that kind of paperwork. But what you don't appreciate, I guess, if someone's looking at the UK, knowing they've got to travel back to a country where they need to be COVID-free, for example, but there's sky-high COVID rates in the UK at the moment, so not that attractive maybe to someone who's thinking, should we do a week-long trip there with the danger that they'll catch COVID while they're here, for example, and then not be able to get home. So it really is, and this is obviously one of the defining themes of the last 2 years has been that patchwork of restrictions, and for as long as some of those still exist, travelling is complicated and the recovery can't really kick fully into gear. I think that's because, if it's only in one direction, that still creates dangers of being stuck in a country or having all sorts of logistical issues if what you don't want to happen happens, basically.
And that recovery is then further challenged by what we're seeing in the Ukraine and there's terrible situation there. The impact on air travel, there seems like a really minor side to it, but clearly from for airlines, for everyone operating in that industry, wondering to what extent that might have an impact on demand in a world which is already, you're already feeling like it's a fragile recovery because no one quite knows what comes next with COVID. Everyone's hoping for the best on that. The war in the Ukraine then creates, wider repercussions, and it's left an industry, especially those, for some airlines in particular in Europe, where their markets are affected.
Yeah, and that's for many reasons. I think the further east you are in Europe, the bigger the challenges there. And there's a sentiment thing there around the desire to travel. But at the same time, obviously, one impact on airlines is that it's exacerbated the rise in fuel costs, for example, which is all feeds back into that cost of living crisis. The Ukraine situation is a difficult one. I think all CEOs you talk to obviously caveat this with the fact that clearly what people are going through in Ukraine, how it's affecting the airline industry, and is obviously in that context a small issue. But the reality is, and I think the airspace closures are one area where it's clearly having a big impact on certain airlines. And it is difficult to see that being resolved quickly. I mean, given where we are today with relations between Russia and Europe, it feels like a lot needs to happen before we're back at that. So you look at an airline like Finnair, where its entire the bulk of its kind of long-haul strategy is based around being able to overfly Russia and have one of the fastest routes into Europe and into Asia via Helsinki. That's a challenge there. You get Air Baltic right on the border of Russia there. Certain routes don't quite work anymore, so they're much more focused on flying west. The bits and pieces there that are significant. I think the airspace one is going to become more significant if it carries on and the general airline recovery continues as well, because we've covered quite a lot how the big European groups weren't really relying on Asia Pacific this summer, for their recoveries essentially. Some of them are flying there, but given that, again, we go back to the travel restrictions that exist in those markets, mean you're not getting anywhere near, the frequencies or demand you would have had pre-COVID. But, if we have a good summer and we're looking, airlines are ready to expand further and the situation in Asia eases more in terms of restrictions, then that creates a challenge, and then possibly more of a capacity crunch into areas where airlines are able to operate economically. So, it's clearly a massively unhelpful development for the industry that's happened. As you say, it's not for the vast majority of carriers, and particularly Russian and Ukraine carriers aside, that it's not changing the narrative too much.
And of course, for many Asian carriers, they were international routes. They're still only really beginning to come back for many markets. And obviously, the restrictions there have started to lift in several of those markets, but obviously the prime example, China and Hong Kong, the lockdown is still very much, or the restrictions are still very much the same as they were at the peak of the crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So again, in that way, as they open this, this gets more significant for the Asia carriers as well. And just touching on that, I was looking at some of the airports data for 2021 earlier, and it's amazing looking at a Hong Kong situation where it's the biggest airport in the world for cargo tons handled in 2021. At the same time, you look at the passenger side of the equation, demonstrating this restrictions impact thing. And, what is it, 74 million in 2019, 1.4 million in 2021. So a long way to go there. But yes, the longer these airspace restrictions carry on, and the other impacts of, particularly on fuel, make flying further to get somewhere even more onerous on your balance sheet, then there's something there we need to keep an eye on, certainly. One
bit of normality that has returned is Atlanta, the biggest airport in the world for passenger numbers, is once again it had its crown toppled by a Chinese airport, but it's back, isn't it?
It's back, yeah. So Guangzhou was number one in 2020. I think in 2019 it was just outside the top 10. It's China's southern hub in the south of the country, not far from Hong Kong. I think what that reflects is obviously Guangzhou number one in 2020, when China was kind of an example of a market that kept open more than others during those certainly once the first couple of months of the pandemic were out of the way. China's domestic market was often viewed as one of the strongest in the world amid obvious challenges. What's happened since then is into 2021, US domestic has really had a strong recovery. So that has pushed a number of US airports there kind of higher in the top 10. I think the top 7 airports in the world in 2021 were in the US in terms of passenger numbers. And that just reflects that the US already had a big domestic market, obviously going into the crisis. And it was able to recover much more quickly than others. At the same time, China, which is another huge domestic market, has kind of stalled a bit. Yeah, we all know about the zero COVID policy there, which is basically stopping international travel into the country of any size. But at the same time, that's also, if a whole city knocks down, for example, like we've seen in Shanghai recently, then it starts to have a big impact on domestic as well.
China's been very stop-start, whereas actually in the US, which only in fact reopened properly for, or to some degree for vaccinated international travellers in November. But, that's still, such was the size of the market, the traffic to Latin America as well, that regained that momentum. And, we have seen that US carriers are expected to be the first to return to profitability, probably this year. And we're seeing that a little bit more now in the business strategies of the airlines, and that notable perhaps for the interest around Spirit Airlines, a low-cost carrier in the US. And we'll speak a bit about that in part 2.
Stay on top of all the latest airline news at flightglobal.com. Find out more on how to subscribe at flightglobal.com/subscribe.
Yes, so welcome back. Probably the biggest news in the industry of the past couple of weeks has been the interest in Spirit Airlines. That was kicked off by a bid from Frontier Airlines, and then JetBlue decided to get involved.
Yeah, it's I remember the early days of the crisis, a lot of people were keen to predict consolidation as a consequence of COVID. But what we've seen is that with such damaged balance sheets, having taken on a lot of debt, airlines in most places are kind of focused on getting their own affairs in order. But so you get this curious situation where in a market that's already cited as a really positive example of consolidation, it's kind of first out the traps again after the industry's biggest ever crisis. But yeah, there's a history to this with Indigo Partners and Bill Franke. They used to be investors in Spirit, and reports suggested when Franke dropped that investment and took on Frontier, that part of the reason was that he was keen for Spirit to purchase Frontier about 10 years ago, was it now? So there was a neat kind of narrative there that Franke was going back and combining those two airlines into this big ultra low cost carrier in the US, and that could still happen. But we've a bit out of the blue, and I think I'm right in saying not unlike what nearly they tried to do with Virgin America.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So with Virgin America, Alaska Airlines, there was a bidding war that emerged between Alaska Airlines and JetBlue for Virgin America, which Alaska ultimately won and ultimately merged. And JetBlue now throwing its hat in the ring for Spirit. Yeah,
it's a higher offer, about 30%, I think. What's curious about all this is the different intentions for Spirit that the two suitors have. So you've got JetBlue saying this is about creating a bigger JetBlue, and when we talk about JetBlue, we're talking about an airline model that's some would describe as hybrid. So can it sometimes describe as low cost, but as we all know, it's got a business class product, for example. It's nothing like the kind of ultra low cost model. Probably, if you're looking at Europe, a bit more like EasyJet, where it's will fly into the bigger airports, for example. But what this is about, taking an ultra low cost product in Spirit and using it to expand JetBlue, and in doing that, it would, I think, jump over Alaska to become the fifth biggest carrier in the country. And it's about, I guess, JetBlue competing more with those, the big three network carriers there. And as we know with JetBlue, they've recently launched transatlantic flights to add a new string to their bow when it comes to network. And what's curious, I guess, is Frontier's intentions are quite different, aren't they?
So Frontier is sort of more of the same. They're both playing in the same field. They're both at that ultra low LCC model part of the business. There's a clear and logical fit to it. Now, Spirit have said, obviously they've taken notice of the extra premium in the offer from JetBlue, so they're willing to engage. It'll be really interesting to see what Spirit decides at the end of this, but also, there could be a role that regulators play in this. JetBlue has an alliance. It's working on the Northeast Alliance with American Airlines, and that's already come under the gaze of the regulators. So you have that element on top of it. I think what's interesting about this is it's easy to view this, and we'd be as guilty as the next man to put together the Merger Mania headline, because that's just is really lovely and it works fantastically well. But as you say, this is it is quite specific to the US, this huge domestic market already, where you're already seeing consolidation. There are some other bits and pieces. We've seen a little bit in Canada, but beyond that, not huge amounts.
Yeah, you've got WestJet looking to buy Sunwing. Not the significance there is the recent history of the leisure market in Canada. So you've got Air Canada's failed purchase of Transat, which is obviously part of the reason why I think they're a bit miffed that maybe there's a tie-up happening elsewhere. But yeah, again, there's very different COVID experience for the Canadian Airlines. So it was much tighter controls on even domestic travel there. So I think there's more of taking the opportunity there to kind of shore up looking ahead, rather than the strengthening quite strong existing positions really that you're seeing with JetBlue, Spirit, Frontier, whatever. But and then in Europe, one of your favourite topics, the airline that would never go away when it goes away, is Alitalia, isn't it? And
Alitalia, who did during the pandemic, they have finally ridden out of the last chance saloon to be the Italian airline replaced by the newly formed ITA Airways. And What's interesting, and it has always been the case with Alitalia as well, is that, regardless of the challenges of the financial model, and who knows how successfully restructured and re-engineered ITA will be, but regardless of the challenges Alitalia had, it was never short of suitors, and so it appears for ITA as well. I mean, Lufthansa are kind of in the box seat. They've been working together with a Swiss logistics firm on pulling together potential bid there. Lufthansa is still saying that they're kind of, I think they're being careful to make clear they're not jumping wholesale into an investment into in pumping. So certainly be at most a minority shareholding initially. Germany's a huge market. Italy is a huge market for Lufthansa. It always has been. It's second largest one outside of Germany and the US, and they've always been active there. They've got Air Dolomiti in the north of the country. They have their own venture out there, Lufthansa Italia, which they based out of Milan. So it's no surprise that they should be interested in seeing opportunity there. But Air France also, who have themselves previously been involved, they're showing some interest too.
Yeah, and that's I think I mentioned earlier, they were coming out of the pandemic. There are reasons why consolidation is quite difficult. I think in the case of Air France, because of the state aid they received, I think part of the conditions there make it difficult for them to commit to an investment in another carrier. But I think their last results briefing, Ben Smith was very open about the idea that, if the conditions were right, they would be interested. Again, it's a big market for Air France, KLM as well. Italy. So we've been here before, there, haven't we? And I think what's interesting is, the Spirit Frontier thing isn't new. JetBlue Spirit is. The Italian national carrier being of interest to other European airlines isn't new. And I think we've got, one thing is, I guess, that we've still got IAG Air Europa going on. So that seems there's some agreement there where IAG has got some exclusivity on that deal now, if that's approved. If their loan to Air Europa is approved. So that's happening. But yeah, what we haven't seen much of is something, new out of the blue. We saw hints of it EasyJet with Wizz. But I was listening to SAS Chief Executive Anko van der Werf talking last week, and he was saying it was kind of the pandemic may have been a missed opportunity consolidation-wise in Europe. When European Commission made its decision to approve, individual pots of state aid for some of the kind of smaller national carriers, and he wasn't excluding his own from that. There was a decision there to allow them to be kept going, and in doing that, as we've just touched on, it's created possibly blocked consolidation for some time. Whereas a consideration could have been, look, this is the chance. These airlines a lot of them aren't profitable. They are being propped up by governments. This is the chance now to say, let's almost have a blank sheet. And, some of these, secondary operators, you look at the level of SAS, TAP might be another one in Portugal, where the business case might not be as clear. You kind of take that opportunity to consolidate. But
of course, the other thing that hasn't changed, especially in cross-border consolidation, all the things that prevented consolidation before, which were, largely around the challenge of retaining traffic rights, all these things that have made it difficult for cross-border consolidation to happen in the past, which has involved, in many cases, airlines either taking minority stakes or turning to partnerships or, finding different kind of structures for it. None of that's changed. So, no. I think people will look at, I think we may be entering a period of strategic partnerships. I can definitely see more strategic partnerships. I can see some bolder things happening, but you're not going to see brands largely disappear. You're not going to see huge consolidations. I think the industry, there are hundreds of airlines that are going into the pandemic. Some have fallen over. Some new ones have emerged. We're still going to be talking about a highly fragmented industry, I think, at the end of this.
And two examples just spring to mind straight away. You've got Norwegian making a comeback and seems to be doing quite well. And in the UK, you've got Flybe, which obviously collapsed right on the eve of the pandemic. But yeah, two brands there that have, as it stands, are in 2022, going to be existing and flying in a European market that has been through a lot. And you sort of feel like, if the pandemic didn't do it, then nothing will. Yeah. It's meant to be a liberalised market, clearly, and it is easier, as we can see with the low-cost carriers. Bases everywhere. The national borders don't matter as much there, but in the same way, their history isn't as flag carriers and as strategic assets for the states. So there's different considerations. But it's
sort of reassuring that 18 months away and we're still talking about Flybe. So it shows something's never change. Thank you, Lewis. We'll leave it there for this week.
Cheers, Graham.
We aim to be back in a shorter period than 18 months with the next Airline Business Podcast. You can find links to the stories we've referenced in the podcast notes, and you can keep up to date with all the latest on how airlines are faring in their recovery efforts at flightglobal.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you again next time.